I think we'll start everything going here. Welcome, my name is Jane Hauser. I am the Director of Marketing and Outreach at NESCA, and I am joined by Sophie Bellenis, NESCA's Occupational Therapist and Real Life Skills Program Manager. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on assessing readiness for learning as we return to school. And Sophie will be walking us through a few slides, and we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. Please, the Q&A feature is enabled, so please enter any questions that you have throughout the presentation there, and use the chat only for any technical issues that you may be encountering. So with that, I will turn it over to Sophie, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophie Bellenis. Thank you so much for being here. As Jane mentioned, I am the occupational therapist here at NESCA. In the past, I have worked as a school-based occupational therapist, delivering direct services, consultation for students. I've worked in the elementary, middle, and high school levels, both in sub-separate classrooms and with students who are participating in the general education setting. So schools are kind of where I feel comfortable. Since transitioning to NESCA, I've been working as a part of our transition team and focusing on school-based assessment, consultation, and then running our real life skills program. Today we're going to be talking about assessing learning as we go back to school. I know that that's on a lot of parents' minds. I'm hoping to shed some light and provide some clarity around what things might look like, some suggestions on where to go from here. There's some guidance that's been released quite recently that I'll be covering, and I'll try to give some suggestions and ideas as we move into this very unique school year. So let's get to it. I will start our presentation slides. And go here. All right, I hope everyone can see that. So I am going to start with a list of our objectives. I'm going to cover a few of the challenges from this spring specific to occupational therapy that I heard from families. Many of them are consistent and being experienced by quite a few different students. We're going to review the current guidance that's been coming out. It's pretty comprehensive and it's coming out frequently. So the most recent guidance came out on Monday, and we'll sort of delve into what that looks like. I'm going to review the process of assessment and then the process of kind of interpreting the IEP and goals, and review where we can go from here with goals. And then I'll try and provide a little bit of a roadmap for first steps to take this fall, what we need to be asking, who to ask, and things that really should be prioritized. And then I'm going to wrap up with just a little bit of a nod to the digital demands of remote learning. School has looked very different, and whether it's a hybrid program or a remote learning program, there's really heightened digital demands and some more need for computer literacy and skills. So we're going to review that a little bit, cover a couple ways we can help our kiddos. So let's get to it. So we'll start with the challenges observed. A lot of the challenges were general, so just kind of overall practitioner, not really skill specific. One of the big ones was a change in the relationship between child and provider. The lack of consistent communication, the lack of in-person meetings really affected how kids see their providers and, their occupational therapists, their speech language pathologists, their physical therapists. It really changed the ability to build that rapport. There was a lack of access to materials. The sensory gyms or the specific OT tools and games and crafts that might be used were not always readily available in the home. There was some difficulty engaging, especially for some of our younger kids, through the video conferencing software. It's really hard to attend, and I think that we saw shorter sessions and we saw sort of less engaging sessions happening sometimes for some students. There was this increase in need to manage the digital material. And then overall, there was really a decrease in consistent routine. And that's that routine that is provided by teachers. It's their go-to, it's their bread and butter. They build routines and they build up supports to help kids with those routines. So that really sort of disappeared. And then there's just been this huge decrease in school-based executive function support. So that help with organization, that help with initiating tasks, that help with sort of managing the emotional and the self-regulation fallout of learning that happens all day, that sort of disappeared. So those are the general concerns that really popped up for families. Specific to motor, there was a definite decrease in hands-on activities. A lot of things went digital. There was a decrease in one-on-one instruction and modeling. Teachers often model maybe, the correct shape of making an A. They might do hand over hand. That kind of all went away. There was a decrease in novel stimuli. And by that, I just mean teachers are constantly switching out games and toys and books for different units and different topics that are being covered. And that sort of went away. So the new toys and the new things to figure out and puzzle through, for some kids disappeared. It was, what they had at home. There was a decrease in reciprocal play. So a decrease in having a back and forth with peers, whether it's on the playground, whether it's during a math game. That reciprocal play helps kids to build skills, and that sort of disappeared. And then finally, this limited access to physical education. I always say that a moving child is a learning child. And I think that my physical education teachers would back me on that. And that for many kids went out the window as well. That being said, there was some creative things that were done, and there were families that totally stepped up, but I thought it was worth mentioning. With regard to sensory needs, there was definitely limited space for a lot of families, whether it's a small backyard or whether it's just going for walks outside of a house. The ability to kind of run around in a huge gym or run around in a huge playground sort of went away. This increase in screen-based activities and learning opportunities and activities really changed how kids were processing information. So there's a huge visual piece there. There's a huge attention piece there that is needed. And so there's been a sensory effect of that screen use. We sort of mentioned the decrease in novel toys, but there was also a decrease in novel sensory information. We weren't seeing kids surrounded by tons of peers and dealing with all of the auditory input and dealing with all of the movement and maybe the tactile stimulation of being bumped into, having to regulate all that. So that was something that was lost a little bit this spring. And then there's this increase in protocols. So there's the masks, there's the hand washing, and all of that is sensory. Having something on your face is a very strong sensory experience and something that kids had to get used to. So there's been this whole shift in the sensory this spring as well. And then finally, I know I touched on this, but I wanted to kind of more specifically explain it, but there's this increased need for digital skills. The keyboarding skills, the ability for precise manipulation of screens. And what I mean by that is, can a child move a mouse and click on an X? Can they click on a login button? Can they figure out how to minimize a screen? That was definitely a new need for some kids, especially if they haven't covered it at school yet. Socialization looks really different in a video conferencing platform. We have some kids that have worked really hard to figure out how to interact with their peers in a productive way, and this whole shift to having to socialize on a screen was really tough for some kids. So that was like a less thought of digital demand that I think some kids struggled with this spring. And then finally, just this introduction of all these new software platforms, online learning programs, organization systems. For some of our high school students, this was different teachers all using different systems just because they were thrown into it so last minute that it hadn't been sort of consistently decided on by a school team. So that was definitely a digital demand. So this is sort of our backdrop. This is what kids, specifically with OT, were dealing with this spring and what has sort of affected their ability to access goals, ability to access services, and where they are right now. What I'm going to move into next is the current guidance that has come out regarding what things are going to look like moving forward in terms of IEPs and assessment. So I'm going to start with sort of this IEPs in the COVID era. The process has not changed significantly. And what I mean by that is the what. What does an IEP look like? What are we trying to help a child accomplish? That really hasn't changed hugely. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of like the where and the how later, because those have shifted, but this process in and of itself hasn't shifted hugely. Meetings have been done remotely. They were happening this spring. I don't want to say they were happening for everyone, but they were definitely happening. People were using Zoom, Google Hangout, and sometimes just phone. IEPs are still being written assuming an in-person learning model, and service delivery is still being determined based on what a child needs, not as what is logistically possible currently with restrictions. Now, I've heard a lot of pushback on that from families saying, you know, it doesn't make sense to write this IEP if it's not actually what they're going to get. I want to speak to that a little bit because I think it's important to look a little bit further forward and think about when kids potentially will get back to a more consistent in-person learning experience. IEPs are going to last until then, and if we start changing everything and dropping the services, when kids get back to school, their programming is going to be based off of a document that was really COVID specific. I think that if we write an IEP that says, look, this is what this child needs, it might look different right now, but let's say they go back in fall of 2021, we know what they need and they're not losing out on any services just because they couldn't be delivered. They'll be walking into a classroom with a list of exactly what they need in an in-person learning model, and it's not like we can be putting together 2 IEPs. And I think it's important to kind of consider how beneficial it will be when in-person learning resumes to have a solid roadmap for that setting. That being said, we're definitely going to have to get creative. I think IEP teams right now who are planning to educate students using a hybrid or an in-person model may want to consider putting a remote learning contingency plan in place. I think the additional information section of the IEP is a great place to put that. But you know, it can be good to know what's going to happen and what it's going to look like. If things have to change, again, things are pretty unprecedented. We don't know what things are going to look like in 2 months, 3 months, and having a plan can be helpful. So IEPs are still being written with this 1-year timeline. They're still being written with goals that are relevant and focusing on skill building, but they are being written with this assumption of an in-person model, and that is just going to have to be worked around for the time being. Moving into assessment, we know that a lot of assessment didn't happen between March and June of last year, so there's definitely this backlog of both kind of initial service eligibility evaluations and 3-year evaluations, reevaluations. There was guidance that came out on August 6th that talks about teleassessment and how that can be used to kind of really assess where our students are. It is recommended when reliable and valid results can be collected. And that sort of decision of whether reliable and valid results can be collected, is being left up to the professional judgment of clinicians. And I think that that's really important to note, because you might be getting different answers from different service providers. You might have an OT that says, I can absolutely do some teleassessment, I can get the data I need. And you might have a physical therapist who's saying, I just can't do it, it's not going to work out. We might have to figure a way for him to be in the school briefly for me to get adequate data. That's just an example, but you may be hearing different things from different people, and I wanted to touch on why. One of the reasons is that there's different guidance coming down from professional organizations. So those professional organizations are the people who license your students, therapists, and clinicians. So for me personally, I'm licensed as an occupational therapist. I get my guidance from AOTA, is our kind of national organization. It's the American Occupational Therapy Association. But APTA, who licenses and is really giving guidance to physical therapists, might be giving out different information. I'll provide, later in this presentation, I'll provide sort of some links of where you could look at what guidance people are getting, but that's just important to consider. Personal student circumstance is really important, whether a student has a place they can take it over a video conferencing platform, whether they have an adult who's able to help with that side of the assessment to give materials or to take any information down. And then it's really just up to clinical observations and judgment. And I think it'll look different across districts and it'll look different across clinicians. But if teleassessment can happen, there's a lot that can be done. It's a good tool. I want to sort of delve into the most recent guidance that we've gotten from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education here in Massachusetts. They touch on these 3 areas. So the first one, I'm not going to speak too much to. It's the general education recovery support. It's actually not technically defined by any federal or Massachusetts state regulation, what this sort of recovery support means, but it's important and I think schools are committed to it. So what it's going to look like are sort of those tier 2, tier 3, so whole population and at-risk population students being targeted with some additional support, some extra services, some follow-up, some sort of assessment of regression. But that's going to be very district specific. I can't speak too much to it, but it is out there and it is part of the guidance. The next thing that we've kind of all been waiting for is this compensatory services. What are we going to do about the services that just didn't happen this spring? And then the last one is new IEP services. And that is new IEP services that are specific to needs that have arisen due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to get a little specific into those next 2 ones. So COVID-19 compensatory services. I'm going to read this definition because I think it's important to consider. COVID compensatory services refers to services that a student's IEP team determines are needed to remedy a student's skill or knowledge loss or lack of effective progress that resulted from delayed, interrupted, suspended, or inaccessible IEP services because of the emergency suspension of in-person education related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is very specific. We're talking about COVID. We're talking about what kids missed. We're not talking about what's happening moving forward. We're not talking about building things out for the fall. This is how are we going to make up for what was missed? The first thing I want to point out that is in the guidance that I think is really important to know is that schools are being told to prioritize data and information coming from families, whether that's with regard to kids' ability to learn remotely, their engagement, how their behavior has changed, whether they've progressed, how they're experiencing home life right now. The guidance has very clearly explained that due to the fact that parents have spent so much time with their kids, caregivers have spent so much time at home evaluating what's going on, whether directly or just through observation, like that information is important and really needs to be considered. And I think it's great that they put that in there. The next thing that's really important is that this is likely not going to be a one-to-one like correspondence with the missed IEP services. If your student should have received 12 weeks of once a week, an hour of services, they're not going to be getting 12 extra weeks of an hour of services. First of all, it might not still be what they need. They might need new services or a new model. And second of all, it's just not reasonable for people to be able to directly make up 3 months of services while they're still providing services for these students. So it likely won't be one-to-one, and I think that that's what we expected, and I think that that's probably quite fair. And then I think it's interesting is that this need for compensatory services, while it can be determined in a formal IEP meeting, it can also be determined through an informal process where the whole team isn't reconvened and it's not a whole new IEP. If asked for and kind of given in writing, this can be a less formal meeting. It can just sort of be a collaboration. And then the last thing that I think is important is that the guidance says that this determination has to be made by December 15th. They recommend that it's done earlier than that, but we're dealing with, hundreds of students per district who need these services, and sort of the hard date to have a real plan for compensatory services is December 15th. I'll move on to this new IEP services. I'm also going to read this one quickly. Students may also require new services to address new areas of disability-related needs, including mental health needs. Decisions regarding new IEP services must be made by teams in accordance with the requirement of state and federal special education law and must be documented in the student's IEP. So right there, it says you'd need an IEP meeting to add new IEP services. But the most interesting thing to me about this is the line here that says including mental health needs. This is what's being anticipated. I think that schools and clinicians are expecting new needs to have popped up, especially social emotional needs. The example I've given here is Billy was receiving OT and reading pre-COVID. Due to circumstances this spring, he's experiencing heightened anxiety and difficulty coping with his emotions. He may need counseling or social emotional support added to his IEP grid. I think we're going to see a lot of that popping up. You know, our students have been affected in really different ways. And this would include some form of assessment, whether it's an observation, whether it's interview, but there would be some assessment and then sort of some determination of services. So this is something to expect. It's absolutely not going to be all students. A lot of students, as we know, kids are so resilient. A lot of students aren't going to need this, but I think it's worth noting that it was put in there as an option. I'm going to move into assessment because I think this word is being thrown around very frequently to mean lots of different things. So when I say assessment, I actually mean 3 different things. So let's go through those. Those 3 things are the initial evaluation. That's your first time that your student's being assessed. It's figuring out whether they're eligible for special ed services and what they need to be successful. Then there's the 3-year reevaluation. It happens every 3 years. It's looking at a student's progress. It's looking at whether skill levels have changed. It's figuring out whether there needs to be any amendment to the service delivery and things like that. And then there's this ongoing assessment piece, which is just going to be huge this fall. We're going to have to be figuring that out. So I'm going to go into those a little bit. But first, I want to sort of define them. So a comprehensive evaluation pre-COVID would be this. And that's an initial evaluation and a 3-year evaluation. They look very similar. But this is what they should look like. There should be an observation across settings. There should be observation of a student in the classroom, at dismissal, in the cafeteria. If it's a adolescent who's working on some vocational skills, there should be some observation in that setting. There's an educational record review, there's interviews, work samples, there's sensory assessment. Then there's the standardized piece. And the standardized piece is where you're going to get the norm reference data. That's where your child's scores are going to be compared to children of similar age. And for an OT evaluation specifically, you're going to be looking into the visual skills, the fine motor skills, and you're going to give a gross motor overview to just see whether they might need a PT evaluation or if their gross motor is functional. What I'm going to show you next is what an evaluation can look like right now. And what I hope you'll see is that it's not that different. There is still observation across some different settings. In a hybrid model, that could be in the classroom, that could be arrival and dismissal, transitions, remote, that could be an observation of a student doing some online learning or attending a course. There's still an educational review, still interviews, work samples, and there's some standardized assessment of these skills. Not every standardized assessment can be used in this format, but some can, and some clinicians are going to be able to get really good standardized data. It's going to have a caveat a little bit of being done in either a different way or through a different model, but there is a real possibility that clinicians can get good data here. First, I'm going to speak to this initial evaluation. While an initial evaluation right now may not be as comprehensive as it would have been, I really feel like it's worth doing. This is going to determine eligibility for services. This is going to get a child connected with a service provider earlier in their academic career. It's going to get them services. It's going to get people on their team thinking about them. I would recommend getting an initial evaluation done, despite some of the things that are going to have to be shifted. I think it's worth it. And it is possible eventually to ask for a reevaluation. And either way, there's going to be a reevaluation in 3 years' time. So we'll see what that looks like in 3 years. I don't know what 3 months from now is going to look like. But I really think that it's worth getting a child assessed if they have not been assessed before. With the 3-year reevaluation, I think that it is likely worthwhile to do now. And I think that working with a clinician, you can figure out kind of whether it's worthwhile for your student and whether it's in the best interest. And that's going to depend on a lot. That's going to depend on the level of rapport that already exists between a clinician and your child. If they've been working with somebody for 5 years, let's say, there's a very, very good chance that this clinician can get excellent assessment data, can really put something together. Even if it's been a year, there's a good chance that they've got, a lot of information about your child. And then it's just kind of student specific. Is that something your child can attend to? Can your child attend to a Zoom session for 20 minutes, 30 minutes? Is the ability there to get some data? So this one's a little bit less black and white, but I think that, clinicians can do it. It just depends on whether it's in the best interest of the student, which is what's most important. And then we kind of get to this sort of assessment of regression, ongoing assessment piece, which is a little bit more amorphous. I think the biggest takeaway here is that it's hugely important to determine levels of current performance. We need to know where kids are at this point, and they are not necessarily where they were in March, and they might not be meeting goals. But I think it's really important to note that while they may not be meeting the specific goals that were set in March, or if they were set last September for some students, just remembering the fact that our kids have all gained skills we weren't expecting. I think that's good to consider. I would request an observation, whether you're doing a hybrid or a remote learning model. Observations can absolutely be done through a video conferencing platform like Zoom or something like that. Like, they definitely can happen that way. And of course in the classroom they can happen. I think that, comparing work samples is a great way to go. A lot of occupational therapists save work samples as they're working with students, and comparing something a child did in February to something that they do for a clinician now could be really helpful. That being said, this may not be possible, right? Like, OTs may not be able to get into their offices. They may not have all the same materials they had, but it's just an option to think about. Often teachers have things saved, or people have things saved. I'm going to move on to the IEPs and goals and sort of what those look like at the moment. So when goals are formulated, an OT is looking at the demands of the environment, the classroom, the grade level, what's expected. They're going to observe the student in their setting. They're going to see kind of how they're functioning. And then they're going to really focus in on the specific skills that they assessed and how that relates to academic and school function. Right off the bat, we know that number one has absolutely changed. The demands of the environment, classroom, and grade are completely different than they were, before March 13th-ish for most people. So that's changed. So these goals might not necessarily make sense. The goal example I have here is, with no more than one verbal prompt, Charlie will copy 3 sentences from the whiteboard at least 3 feet away with 100% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. We don't know. Whoever was writing a progress note in June doesn't know whether Charlie was able to do this, because Charlie hasn't really been at a whiteboard 3 feet away being assessed on multiple opportunities. But that doesn't mean that Charlie hasn't built visual perception, visual memory, and fine motor skills. There's a good chance that his typing speed has absolutely increased. There's a good chance that his ability to manipulate a mouse is much better. So I think it's really important to get at the root of what a goal is assessing. A lot of these goals, of course, are focused on school function, but they're really all coming back to one specific skill area. And that's what you want to know, is what was my child trying to build that this goal was representing? So with the goals, just a few things to consider. They may have regressed, and they may not be on track to meet their goals. Part of that is going to be the demands of the environment changing. Part of that is going to be a change in service delivery if they weren't seeing their clinician or their therapist this spring. And so the goals might not make sense. New skills may need to take priority, so goals might have to be kind of dramatically shifted, just if they don't really make sense anymore. The goals should still be achievable within a year time frame. We really do want to try and set goals that are reasonable, but they just might look different than they did before. And finally, I say ask what buzzwords may be worth searching, and that's mostly because there's a lot of really good occupational therapy information out there on the internet, and that's blogs, that's articles, that's occupational therapists who have dedicated a lot of time to giving really comprehensive suggestions. And so if you talk to your child's OT at the school about what buzzwords to search, it may be helpful to find sort of home-based activities that target those skill areas. So that's just worth considering as we move forward with goals. So I'm going to move into the section where we sort of lay out a roadmap of important things to do as we move into the fall. And the first thing I have here is to review your district's plan. Everything looks really different. You know, from Lexington out to the Berkshires, to the North Shore, to Beverly, Mass, like everybody has really different plans. And they've all been built with a lot of care and a lot of effort and a lot of work from school committees and administrators but everyone. But the reality is that they're really different. So I can't give specific guidance on a plan, but it's important to know what yours looks like. So in terms of remote learning, will video conferencing software be used to deliver services? Will they be used to deliver classes? Is there going to be synchronous learning offered? What changes have been made since this spring's remote learning plan? That one is mostly in there because I think it's really important for students to know that the fall is not going to look like this past spring. You know, this spring was very much a scramble to try and maintain skills, to do our best. Teachers were thrown into figuring things out, and they absolutely worked really hard to make that happen. But at this point, we've had a whole summer to plan. So it's not going to look the same, and I think students should be prepared for that, because I think the reality is that a lot of them are expecting it to look like it did this spring. With a hybrid model, I think it's important to know, will your child receive any or all of their direct services while at school? If they're going for a half day that's only 3 or 4 hours, are they going to be losing out on class time to be pulled out for services, or are services going to be added kind of supplementary as a remote service or an online model? So I would review just the plan in general. I would review all information regarding special ed, and I would write down a really solid list of questions that you want clarified. Obviously, everything is written relatively generic to cover all families, but you're going to have specific questions that apply to your child. And I think it's great to have those really written down. The next thing I would suggest is to ask for a specific plan. Service providers, so, you know, your OT, your SLP, school counselors, often spend the first week or two of school figuring out what their schedule is going to look like, how they're going to fit everyone in. And it's a unique process where teams get together and, you know, figure out time slots, and it's pretty complex, and it's, you know, it's a group effort. But it takes the first week or two of school generally. So services start maybe a week or two after the start date. Schools this year are already starting 2 weeks late, right? So we're starting in the middle of September. If we have a week or two for planning and scheduling, we're talking about October at this point. I would ask for a specific date that you will know what it's going to look like. And I think schools will do their absolute best to meet that date. Again, we are all going to have to be flexible. Things are in constant flux. But I think it would be helpful to have a specific day that you can anticipate a plan. One thing I'd want to know is clarifying how B-Grid and C-Grid services will be delivered. So B-Grid is your push-in. That's your clinician going into the classroom, helping support in that environment. And your C-Grid is pull out. So it's taking them out of the classroom to work on a very specific skill. These decisions are made with a lot of assessment, with clinical judgment, with reasoning. You know, kids aren't arbitrarily put on in the B-Grid or in the C-Grid. It's very intentional. So I would ask how that's going to be handled. What's it going to look like? And everyone's going to get different answers, and it's likely all thought out and good answers, but you want to know. You want to know the difference. Another thing is how individual and group sessions are going to be handled. Are students going to be meeting in groups? Is everything going to be individual? For some districts, that might make the most sense. It might be the safest. And if that's what they're prioritizing, some schools might be switching to all individual services. Some schools might be switching to group services on video conferencing platforms, whether that's maybe a lunch bunch or a social group meeting, you know, over the internet. So just figure out kind of how that is going to be handled, because again, those decisions are made deliberately. Those decisions are made with the student's best interest in mind. Is this student going to benefit from individual or benefit from group? So you want to know what it looks like. And then I have this kind of double star at the bottom. Due to the current reality, it's important to be flexible and collaborative. Having a plan keeps everyone on the same page. Things will likely change. Everyone's doing their best, and I think that being flexible is really the only way we're going to have an outcome that is plausible, that we can actually make happen. And then my last suggestion is just to reach out to specific providers. Ask, how will services be delivered? Connecting with the people that you work with is really, your child works with, is really important. You know, it's funny, I mentioned in a webinar I gave this spring that the teachers really want to be checking in individually with all of their kids. Absolutely. Teachers teach because they love children. But the reality is that when you have a ton, you're often going to answer the emails that are directly come to you. You're going to respond to parents' emails. You're going to check in with people who reach out to you. So I think reaching out to a service provider is similar. They would love to be checking in with all their caseload on the first day of school. But if they walk into an email from someone, that's likely what's going to get answered first. So I think that that's worth doing. I think it's important to ask about their communication with general education teachers. Consultation services on the IEP, so your A-grade services. They sometimes happen at the end of a class block. They often happen in weekly team meetings. Sometimes they happen just because they have the same class together and they sit down at the same end of the class and they talk about a student for 10 minutes. All of those are great ways to consult, but might look really different, and that sort of hallway conversation isn't happening, likely. So I would really want to know how they're communicating. I would want to know their thoughts on any new needs that they anticipate. I expect some digital needs are going to be focused on. I expect some social emotional needs are going to be focused on. And then there's this piece around how they recommend gathering some assessment data. So if you remember, I mentioned when I was talking about the compensatory services that families' input and families' assessment and data about what's been happening is really going to be taken into account. I would ask whether there's any way that you can help through this kind of month of September with taking data, or if there's a sheet that you could be filling out, or if they're going to be really just looking for observational data. That's what I'd ask, because then you know that you're targeting the right things and you're going to come to the meeting with all the information that they'd like to hear. These are just a couple of OT specific questions that I think are worth asking. I know some of this has been general, but I wanted to go a little bit more specific. So we talked about this one a little bit, the what previous assessment results are being targeted with each goal. That's obviously for a child who's been assessed and has had an initial evaluation before. So what exactly are you targeting? Are you targeting visual motor integration? Is that something I can look into? Are you targeting fine motor specifically? Are you targeting visual perception? Like, what are you actually getting at to help my student be more successful with academic performance? What specific skills are being targeted in order to increase my child's ability to meet this goal? So that's similar, but it's not necessarily directly linked to the assessment. And then this last one, what can I do to target the skill without simply repeating and practicing the activity at home? So my example there is holding a pencil. So if a student's holding a pencil, and working on a pencil grip, they're working on hand placement, they're working on finger strength, they're working on correct posture, they're working on how to hold the paper and support the paper with their left hand. They're working on a lot, but they don't just need to be writing things over and over and over to practice that and to build those skills. There's a good chance they can be playing games where they have to pinch, whether there's any board games they could do, whether there's any things they can do outside to build these skills. So that's something I'd ask, just because, you know, kind of despite or regardless of what model kids are going to be learning, and they are going to be spending a bit more time in the home likely. So what can you do to sort of target the goals? And then this is specific to safety protocols. How can an OT help with the sensory demands and the new safety protocols? There's a good chance that your OT has some fabulous recommendations that are really specific to your child. And then what can I do now to start preparing my child for prolonged time wearing a mask or consistent hand washing or things like that? One suggestion that I've heard recently that I absolutely love is for students who are kind of practicing wearing masks for extended periods of time is requiring a mask if a child is having screen time. That just means that they're wearing a mask if they want to watch TV. And we're either going to have kids who aren't having too much screen time and aren't watching too much TV, or are just really getting acclimated to wearing a mask frequently. You know, they're just sitting watching TV with a mask on. I think it's a good way to kind of pair it with a preferred activity and an incentive to practice. The last thing I really want to delve into is this digital literacy piece, because I think that's been one of the huge changes that we've seen over really the last 5 to 6 months, is that kids are on the computer and they need to know a lot about it and how to use it. So the demands of digital learning are huge, and OT skill deficits make it more difficult. You know, the visual perception needs can be really different or difficult if you have a lot of different things on the screen. It can be really difficult to move a mouse if you have fine motor deficits. It can be really difficult for our younger kids to use a mouse even if they don't have fine motor deficits. Keyboarding is really tough. It's a skill that needs to be taught and learned. So I would reach out to your OT and focus on whether they have recommendations for a typing program that a kid can be practicing on some of their time at home. I would ask for some insight or ideas about bolstering that sort of organization and executive function success. And I put this visual guides for learning new software. A lot of kids are going to benefit from sort of a step-by-step with printouts of each screen. And I know of some OTs who have already built those out for students and might be able to share those. So whether a student's having a hard time figuring out what buttons they need to click on in what order for maybe using Google Classroom correctly, an OT might have 4 different pictures with the correct button circled on each one. And that can be really helpful. And then there's this huge need to learn how to appropriately use digital organization and physical organization. So when I say digital organization, sorry, I'm trying to go to my next slide. There we go. When I say digital organization, what I mean is, do your students know how to save their passwords so that they're not going to be frantically trying to get a password before a class starts? Do they know how to save things into files and folders that they will be able to find later? What I see a lot, I work in doing executive functioning coaching with lots of students. And what I see a lot is, let's say a student's doing a book report on the Odyssey. They're just going to label that document the Odyssey and save it to documents. That's difficult to find when you go back and what you think of it as English language arts book report, because you're going to start searching things like book report, English language arts. But if you put in place a really specific digital organization system that is consistently using one folder for one class and labeling in a consistent format, that's just saving time, and that's teaching students how to make things easier for themselves. I think OTs can help with this. I don't know if they are preparing to help with this, but I think they are definitely a great resource and somebody to ask. And again, you know your kids. For some students, this is easy, but for a lot of students, this is tough and overwhelming, and they may just need some time getting things set up. I would almost recommend getting it set up before school even starts, helping them organize their documents folder and all sorts of things like that. And then the last thing that's really important, especially with this digital learning piece where students are staring at a computer, is posture. Posture is huge. It helps with fatigue, it helps with attention, it helps with building core strength that is so important for helping our kids feel like they have a good physical foundation. And I have a visual here, and there's a link to a great article on the benefits of good study posture. But the real thing to think of is the rule of 90 degrees. So 90, 90, 90. You want their hips at 90 degrees, you want their knees at 90 degrees, you want their ankles at 90 degrees, and you want their feet on the floor. This student in the picture is using a slant board, so it's kind of helping him sit up straight because it's tilted up a little bit towards him. For some students, that's great. For some students, they don't need it or they don't like it. But even keeping their elbows at 90 degrees when they're typing is great if possible. So that's definitely something to think of. And then at the end here, I have some resources. I have the link to the PowerPoint that went out to special educators that has some information about assessment. Slides 23 and 24 talk about tele-assessment, and I think they're interesting. I think they're really right on target. I think they're prioritizing the best interest of the student. They're leaving some decisions up to clinicians, which is really important because our clinicians know our kids and they know the capabilities of their assessment protocol. And the second thing I have here is the really recent one that I sort of talked about, the recovery support and the compensatory services and the new IEP services. I gave a quick overview. This document's actually quite long, but if you want to take a look at it, it does have some really good information about sort of what to expect looking back at what we'll be making up for and what to expect moving forward for what we need to be doing as we get back to school to make up for kind of what kids lost. The last thing I have given resources to, I know I mentioned this earlier, but the professional organizations are really influencing how clinicians are acting and how they're making decisions because they're sort of the governing board for our clinicians and our therapists. So I put the links in here for occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech language pathology, school social workers, and school psychologists. And this is sort of the guidance for each of them. I know that, I'm an OT, so I reference AOTA, but I know that students who receive OT services often receive lots of other services as well to help them out. So I wanted to make that available if people are kind of curious about the guidance that their students, service providers are getting from their licensing boards and their professional organizations. So that is sort of it for me today with this topic. I think the last thing I'd like to leave on is that if your students are not meeting their yearly goals, I would recommend focusing on the things that they have built that you weren't anticipating, the ability to be resilient, the ability to deal with some boredom. Digital literacy skills have gone up across the board. I think it's important to consider the things that have come out of this that aren't just a regression or a lack of skill development.
Great, and feel free to enter any questions you have in the Q&A section. We do have one. It says, what can OTs do to evaluate and support students? Whoop.
I'm sorry.
Okay, what can OTs do to evaluate and support students after evaluating how able they are to scan the screen, type in a timely manner, etc. during remote learning?
So in terms of intervention services to work on those skills?
It looks like, yes, how OTs can support them.
Okay, great. So there's a lot of stuff OTs can do. We're in regard to the typing, OTs have a lot of different programs that specifically lead to typing. There's some adaptive equipment that might be helpful for some students who are having trouble with typing. There are great programs that focus on finger placement that have really good motoric development for kids to be learning home row, to be learning how to move their fingers up and down. There's lots of different programs that OTs can recommend. There's some finger strength and finger endurance activities or exercises that OTs can recommend. Your OT in your school should be able to provide you with that information. They can also get an assessment of typing speed, and they can see whether that's sort of commensurate with where they should be with regards to state guidelines. State guidelines for typing speed is about 5 words per minute per grade level. So a first grader should be able to type about 5 words per minute, and a 5th grader should be able to type 5 times 5, so 25 words per minute. The reason for that is that you end up leaving 12th grade with hopefully a typing speed of about 60 words per minute, which is a really functional adult typing speed. So your OT can get an assessment of where your student's currently at. With regard to visual tracking and visual scanning, there are exercises OTs can provide. There may be some suggestions for covering up part of the screen. There may be some Zoom features they would recommend so that a child isn't having to scan across page, but they might just be scrolling. It's all really kid specific, but this is kind of OT bread and butter. This is stuff that they should be able to focus in on and give you specific examples that will help your child.
Great. And I have another one. What about assessments that were started last year but weren't able to be completed due to the emergency shutdown? Should we start over, or can they pick up where they left off?
That's a good question. I think that the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, you are going to want to start over. 6 months or 7 months, if we're getting into October, is a very long time within an assessment period. And the data before there was regression from not being in school, before there was, a few of those other things, I just don't think it's necessarily accurate data anymore. There are a few things, specific things that OTs test that I think the data does carry over. An example of that would be ocular motor skill. Ocular motor skill is the ability to track something with your eyes. So it's looking up, looking down, going to the corners. It's very unlikely that if a student had really functional ocular motor skill, that would have seen any change. That's really a developmental skill that once you've developed it, you likely will keep it. So I don't want to say that there's nothing that an OT could say. I got pretty good data on this before, but in general, I would say most of the data from 7 months ago, before a very, very unprecedented disruption, is likely not accurate enough to be used when you're informing goals and you are informing kind of service delivery as a whole.
Okay. And how do we get the observation information or any kind of data that parents have been collecting to the school, and who should we go to for that?
Okay, that's a great question. So my first thought is go to your liaison. And I think the best place to present that data is likely going to be in a meeting, whether it's a Zoom meeting, whether it's a phone meeting, providing that information and giving the information. I think you're going to want to have conversation about it. I don't think you want to just be sending things in. But I think it's very worth reaching out to a liaison and asking sort of what information will be beneficial for them and what they're looking for. So is observational data going to be enough? Are they going to be kind of considering more tracked or, specific data more? Is there a form they can give you in order to get that information? I don't think all these meetings are going to be happening right away, obviously, right? Like we're looking at December 15th as kind of our hard deadline is figuring out compensatory services. And I would recommend asking what they want to know, because likely the answer to the questions, but you might want to be tracking things and getting some things in writing and written down.
Okay. And if a parent chooses to switch a child from the hybrid model within their district to an all remote model, or should the district all go remote, how should parents then start taking data, or how do you kick off that process?
That is something that I think needs to be talked about in advance. And I mentioned a little bit the remote learning contingency plan. I think a good place to put that would be the additional information section. And I think that it's important to have that conversation so that there isn't this huge disruption in everything. Let's say a student switches from hybrid to remote. If you haven't had that conversation, what that likely will look like is a student, sending emails to their providers, sending emails to the liaison, trying to set up a meeting to change what it'll look like, everybody figuring out when they have time in their schedule, finally having a meeting, getting it all set up. That's going to take a week or two at the least. What I think would be really helpful is to have the meeting and say, all right, what's this going to look like? Should my kid go remote? Should my district go remote? What will this be? How is it going to go? What's the plan going to look like? So that you can kind of jump right into it. And even if it doesn't end up happening, it's not a waste of time. You know, I think it's worth dedicating time to having a plan ready to go should things have to change.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see anything else coming in. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us and taking the time today. And thank you, Sophie, for your presentation. And we will be sending this presentation out in a follow-up email to our participants. So thanks again for joining. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Take care.